In 2011, a flood on the Brisbane River occurred in which 33 lives were lost and approximately 14,000 properties were flooded. In a March 2023 article developed by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, it is stated that the engineers that were responsible for operating the dams upstream of Brisbane received death threats, they were criticized for poor decision making, they were accused of ignoring the official dam operations manual, and they were referred to the Crime and Misconduct Commission. In addition, a lawsuit was brought against the three entities responsible for operating the dams. But was all of this warranted? Three of the engineers responsible for operating the dams during the event developed a paper for the 2022 Hydrology and Water Resources Symposium to tell their side of the story. Having had the privilege of participating in the resulting lawsuit and having been involved in the field of reservoir operations for about the past 20 years, I developed this video to expand on some of the items presented in their paper to help answer the question, did the engineers act incompetently during the event? In the newspaper article, the reservoir engineers discussed the myth that if only the dams were operated correctly, there would be no flooding below them. They were specifically referring to the Brisbane River dams, but this myth is common below many dams, probably even below the dam pictured here. We can talk about the limited capacity of reservoirs, but we can also look at statements in the manual. For example, this is one of the statements that govern the operation of Wivenhoe Dam, and it says that the gate should be in the fully open position before the water level reaches 75.7 meters. Since this is in the manual, it tells me that there is an expectation that having all of the spillway gates completely open can happen. We can also look at a physical feature of Wivenhoe Dam, and that's the auxiliary spillway, which has the purpose of providing additional release capacity above that of the main spillway for protection of the dam. Again, this was constructed since there is the possibility that it will be needed. Many dams have curves that govern their spillway operations. As these curves get further to the right, the reservoir release significantly increases with small changes in elevation, so the potential for large releases to occur is there. So this tension exists between the myth that dams prevent all or most flooding by property owners and the reservoir engineer's knowledge that large damaging releases can occur and that they are documented in our manuals. You might accept that but still be uncertain about whether the 2011 flood was operated as expected. We can look at this summary plot of inflow, which is shown by the dark blue line, outflow, which is the light blue line, and pool elevation. And this is at Wivenhoe Dam. The first inflow peak is reduced by about 8,000 cubic meters per second. It does this by storing water in the flood pool. This creates a benefit to areas downstream of Wivenhoe Dam. The 2011 event did have a second inflow peak. That inflow peak was reduced by about 4,000 cubic meters per second due to having less flood storage available. Less flood storage was available due to the strategy of keeping transportation routes open earlier in the event, and also maximum downstream flow limits for protection of urban areas as the event became more severe. Since the operation of the dams is governed by downstream conditions, these are termed as Method A reservoirs. And one of the features of Method A reservoirs is that it increases the risk of having an appreciable portion of the flood storage capacity filled when a large subsequent flood occurs. So although there was criticism of not having as much storage for the second rise, this risk is understood as being a feature of these types of reservoirs. In the paper written by the reservoir engineers, there were several items that they disagreed with in respect to the alternatives presented by the plaintiffs. There were numerous alternatives presented in an effort to convince the court that there was a better or more competent way to operate the reservoirs. I'm going to examine three of these items that the reservoir engineers disagreed with. The first being the drawing of the reservoirs down into the supply pool, second being the method for selecting the release strategy, and third being the balancing that needs to occur between Wivenhoe and Somerset. In the alternative operations, the pool was often drawn down below the full supply level to create more space for forecasted rainfall. But what does the manual say about this? There's a statement in the manual that says that the reservoir volume above full supply level of elevation 67.0 is available as temporary flood storage. This is a common type of statement that can be seen in reservoir operations guidance and some water control manuals. Its meaning is well understood by experienced reservoir operators in that it specifies which portion of the pool is used for flood mitigation. However, its meaning got twisted in the lawsuit and became more of a legal definition instead of an engineering one. Since the wording doesn't say that only the reservoir volume above elevation 67.0 is to be used, it was argued that the use of supply storage for flood mitigation is not specifically prohibited. I developed a simple analogy to provide some perspective on this argument. Let's say that you tell your child that they can go take $20 out of your wallet and go buy a toy, but they decide to take two 20s and go buy two toys. Does that make it okay because you didn't specifically prohibit that? This simple analogy can help you better understand how to interpret this statement and avoid reading more into a passage than what is there. The manual also states that the spillway gates are not to be opened for flood control purposes prior to the reservoir level exceeding elevation 67.25. To get the flows needed to move into the supply pool, the spillway gates needed to be open in the alternatives. Not only are the spillway gates open in the supply pool, but the openings were increased in some of the alternatives. The plaintiffs claim that elevation 67.25 was simply a trigger to initiate spillway gate openings. However, if using the spillway gates to draw down the reservoir into the supply pool is the intended operation, then waiting until elevation 67.25 is reached would seem unnecessary. I wanted to provide you with the interpretation from an experienced reservoir engineer on what that statement really means. So what you're looking at, the blue line is going to be a pool elevation hydrograph, and the red line is going to be elevation 67.25. So at elevation 67.25, or up into elevation 67.25, your spillway gate should still be in the closed position. As your pool continues to rise, it's going to become necessary to then open up the spillway gates. And as you get further increases in pool elevation, you're going to continue to increase this release or these spillway openings. You'll get to the peak, the pool elevation will peak, and at that point you shouldn't need any further openings in your spillway. And eventually it'll start to fall. Once you're on this falling limb or this recession limb, you can start to make closures to the spillway. Once the pool elevation falls all the way back down to elevation 67.25, your spillway should either be closed or getting very close to being closed. The manual also provides further guidance on the timing of the release. This statement says the aim during a flood event should be to empty stored floodwaters within 7 days after the flood peak has passed through the dam. A similar statement in the manual says that the level of flooding as a result of emptying stored floodwaters after the peak has passed is to be less than the flood peak. The manual is informing us that releases are to take place after the flood peak has passed and that stored floodwaters are released, not anticipated inflows. The next issue is the selection of strategy, which leads to the development of releases from the reservoir. Wivenhoe has 4 strategies labeled W1 to W4 with sub-strategies within these. Higher level strategies allow access to higher releases. To determine a strategy, the plaintiffs used an assumption of 0 release along with forecasted inflow. This is shown by the green line. The plaintiffs then developed a release strategy that draws the pool down into the supply storage and then refills it with the projected inflow. However, the issue with this approach is that the elevation to give access to that strategy is never reached. So additional iterations are needed until the assumed release is accessible to the reservoir engineer based on the elevation that is achieved. The plaintiffs termed this as being illogical or circular reasoning, but in reality it's simply an iterative process. Another way to think of this is figuring your bank balance by considering only income while ignoring the expenditures. When looking at it in this manner, it should be easier to understand that a 0 release assumption is not logical or appropriate. The next item deals with the balancing of Wivenhoe and Somerset Dams. This is done to equalize the risk between the two dams. The balance line shows the desired balance. Above the line means Wivenhoe is too high, below the line means Somerset is too high. Since Somerset Dam is upstream of Wivenhoe Dam, the plaintiffs decided to store more water in Somerset in their alternatives. This leads to less water going into Wivenhoe for a period of time and less water released downstream to Brisbane during that time. This, however, changes the dynamic of the risk between the two dams. Typically, the risk will shift slightly from one dam to the other as balancing operations occur. However, the plaintiffs are intentionally shifting the risk onto Somerset Dam by storing more water. They used a passage in the manual that states that the balance should generally be followed to claim that it's more of a guide. However, I took it as an acknowledgement that keeping the projects in balance is difficult, but decisions should be made to move them towards balance. I also don't equate the wording generally be followed with intentionally ignoring. The black line shows the actual balancing that occurred, while the green line shows the proposed balancing in the alternative. It is noted on the plot that Wivenhoe has no storage in use while Somerset has 4.5 meters in this alternative. One might assume that releases from Somerset Dam can quickly be made to bring the projects in balance. However, issues can arise, and having the projects in balance can provide needed time. Power and communication issues can occur, or equipment issues can occur at the dam. From this, you should realize that keeping the projects in balance should not be considered incompetent. So you might be asking yourself, is there anything that the reservoir engineers did that you are critical of? My main criticism would be the ambiguity of some of the statements in the water control manual. The first is somewhat of an introductory statement that attempts to discuss operational objectives. However, it does lead to some unnecessary confusion among the readers. According to the manual, these objectives are listed in order of importance, with the first objective being to ensure the structural safety of the dam. This should always be the case. I don't see anything controversial about this. However, I do want to remind you of the shifting of the risk that took place to Somerset Dam in the alternative operations that was discussed earlier in this video. I can see how the next two objectives can be interpreted in different ways. The second objective is to provide optimum protection of urbanized areas from inundation, and the third is to minimize disruption to rural life in the valleys of the Brisbane and Stanley rivers. I interpreted this to mean that the rural bridges and low water crossings are inundated as the event becomes more severe. However, I can see where an interpretation of closing bridges earlier due to forecast rainfall could be convincing to the court. However, I cannot accept violating the rules discussed previously to accomplish that. Finally, placing the retaining of the full supply level below the other objectives can cause confusion about the importance of this. Absent other statements in the manual that I had discussed earlier, I can see where someone might think that the supply storage could be sacrificed for flood mitigation purposes based on this statement. The main issue that I have with this group of statements is that it doesn't clarify the operations, but it does introduce the opportunity for a variety of interpretations. I typically recommend removing these types of statements for water control manuals as I find them to be unnecessary. Another statement in the manual is that the strategy chosen at any point in time will depend on the actual levels in the dams and the following predictions, which are to be made using the best forecast rainfall and stream flow information at the time. So you can see they start to use the word forecast rainfall and using forecast rainfall. The problem with that is that when most individuals hear the use of forecast rainfall, they equate that to pre-releasing. However, there are other ways to use rainfall forecast other than pre-releasing, and based on some of the statements we looked at earlier, it doesn't appear that pre-releases are the intended operation. The criticism that I have about this statement is that it would need to be more specific regarding how these forecasts are to be used to avoid the situation where multiple interpretations can exist. And that's not only my opinion. There was a review that was done by two U.S. agencies responsible for operating dams, the Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation, and they came to the same conclusion that they should probably include more details regarding how the rainfall forecasts are utilized in the decision-making process. They also had another finding that was similar to mine, and that sure, a slightly different alternative operation could have been used, but it's my opinion that when confined to the constraints discussed earlier in this video, a significantly different result would not have been possible. This issue of interpretation of the manual led the reservoir engineers to make this statement in their paper. And the statement is that it seems incredible that the interpretation of the flood mitigation manual, and I use that interchangeably with water control manual, but that the interpretation adopted by the flood engineers could be considered less compelling than the interpretation of someone without operational experience. And what the statement is referring to is the fact that the plaintiff's witness had never operated a reservoir. And this can make it difficult on the court to fully understand the nature of reservoir operations and can allow some misconceptions to be brought forward. One of these misconceptions that I wanted to cover deals with this issue of seasonal pools. And this would be a full supply level, and obviously full supply level is just that delineation between the storage in the flood pool and the storage that's used for supply or conservation purposes. Now at Wivenhoe and Somerset, the full supply level is constant throughout the entire year, and there was the misconception in the court that if you have this constant full supply level, then you are going to need to draw the pool down due to rainfall forecast because you're not drawing it down during the wet season. Now, this is a very common misconception. I was disappointed to hear this come up in court, and we did try to correct this, but obviously we're not sure of the full impact that our correction had. But I did want to provide a little bit more background on this. The reason why there's this misconception is that most people look at this time of the year and they see the full supply level moving downward, and they just assume that the original supply pool is up here and that you're now borrowing this supply storage for flood mitigation purposes. However, that's not correct. The reason why you have seasonal pools is actually due to what's going on at a different time of the year, and what you're trying to do is to capture some of the runoff that's coming in towards the end of this rainy season to try to extend your supply pool. So in reality, your original supply pool is down here, and instead of borrowing supply storage for flood purposes, you're actually borrowing flood storage for supply purposes, since that supply water is very valuable. So as I wrap up this video, I do want to recommend that if you have any comments, whether or not they're in agreement or in disagreement, then feel free to put them in there. If you have any questions, feel free to put that in the comments. I welcome all of the comments, and feel free to share the video because I can get more exposure for this video and get more people to be able to review this. As you can probably tell from this video, I don't really think that the reservoir engineers did anything that was incompetent, or that they didn't act in an incompetent manner. And as far as the issue with the ambiguity in the manual, it's a good lesson for us. It's a good lesson learned to make sure that as we're writing these water control manuals, or really any material that we produce, that we try to minimize those statements in the manual that can be subject to alternative interpretations. And that could be alternative interpretations by the general public or by reservoir operators. And I did want to leave you with this thought. It's very easy to blame the dam engineers and to try to leave it at that. However, there's many of us that are trying to get people to understand that the amount of damage that you have during a flood event is going to be proportional or caused by how much development that you have in the floodplain. It's a very good book that's written about the history of Brisbane floods, and there's a quote that I wanted to pull out of this book. And it says that the 2011 floods have proved less of a deterrent than many expected, and as time passes, prudent and sensible development decisions on the floodplain become less likely. And I think that this quote really summarizes the concern that I and many other reservoir engineers have about this development that's occurring in the floodplain, and also about the myth that the dams will protect them from future flooding. So I hope that you got something out of this video, and I thank you for watching.